welcome to Cooking with the Creative Contessa. So today I'm going to be making kale chips. This is one of my favorite snacks. It's very nutritious, it's very filling, and most of the commercial versions that are available are A, very expensive per pound, and B, also contain ingredients that I really don't want in my daily diet, like sugar, for instance, usually refined sugar. So let's look at our ingredients first for the Contessa's kale chips. Key ingredient is virgin coconut oil. And virgin coconut oil means that it hasn't been refined. That means that all of the nutrients are still intact and also the fatty acid profile, and that it hasn't been subject to chemicals that will probably be left over in at least trace amounts or more. So this is very beneficial in the sense of the kind of fatty acids that it contains. It contains medium chain triglycerides, which actually encourage your body to burn fat. So it's fat burning fat. Actually, it encourages your body to burn energy. So energy burning fat, which is good. Also, of course, because it's virgin, it hasn't been refined, so it still has a light taste of coconut, but this will not make your kale chips into coconut chips, I promise. Another thing I like to add to mine is tahini, and this is raw tahini, which means that it's just sesame seeds that have been ground up into basically a sesame seed paste. Traditional tahini actually is toasted sesame seeds that have been ground. I use one or the other. Right now I just happen to have raw tahini, so I'm going to go with that. The benefit of the raw tahini is that the seeds haven't been exposed to heat, so the micronutrients are more intact and the fatty acids are more intact. In addition to those two sources of fat, I like to sprinkle nutritional yeast flakes on top of mine. Most nutritional yeast flakes have been fortified with vitamins like folic acid and vitamin B2. And that's good, so that adds a little extra nutrition. I add this though mostly for the flavor, and it's very high in dietary fiber. So it adds fiber to your kale chips and quite a bit of protein. So it makes your kale chips much heartier and also kind of helps stiffen them and make them crunchy when you bake them up in the oven. And of course, I cap everything off, most everything in my kitchen, with Himalayan salt or with sea salt. This is pink Himalayan salt, which was once upon a time, many hundreds of millions of years ago, sea salt. The nice thing about Himalayan salt is that it was created before humans started dumping everything unimaginable into the ocean. So whereas modern sea salt might contain a variety of heavy metals that you really don't want to ingest, Himalayan salt will most likely not contain those impurities. So the main ingredient, of course, kale. Now kale comes in a variety of types. There's curly leaf, there's flat leaf, there's different colors. I prefer the curly leaf because it has more delicious little crevices with which we can capture coconut oil and the tahini and the various flavors, and it also just creates a much more interesting texture, I think. Now the first thing you have to do is remove the kale from the center stalk. When the center stalk is thinner like this, I go ahead and include that. But once you start getting into this really thick part, this doesn't really dry, it just gets jerky, like chewy, and it's not very edible or chewable, in fact, just because of the nature of the stalk. So what I like to do is I rip off the top part, and then I just go down the sides, ripping off all the little leafy bits, and even get the little leaves. That's fine. They will make cute little chewy, crummy bits. And you're going to do this with the entire pile of kale. I like to do 3 or 4 heads of kale at a time so that I can create a nice big batch, and that becomes my snack food for the week. Whenever I am feeling low and I need a power boost, I go for my kale chips. And it's so filling and so delicious that you really don't need many, and you feel satiated very quickly. The feeling of satiation is very pleasant. Unlike high starch or high carbohydrate forms of snack, like potato chips or, well, any kind of root vegetable chip actually. Kale, of course, also host to a wide profile of micronutrients, potassium, a whole host of vitamins B, calcium. I think there's some selenium and some vitamin K, depending on the soil in which your kale was grown. So I, of course, also therefore prefer to use organically grown, or if I know the farmer, I know that they're growing it in very nutrient-rich soils, because a nutrient-rich soil is going to make sure that your vegetables are also nutrient-rich. So go ahead and just keep stripping until you get all of this done, and then we're going to move on to washing. So I'm just going through and making sure we don't have any leaves that are, too big. Like this shouldn't be one leaf. So apart. And then what we are going to do is wash it, because kale tends to be a very dirty plant indeed. And I mean that literally. You will see once we wash this. I like to do this with warm water. Once we wash it, you'll see at the bottom a great deal of fine silt. The same properties that allow these kale leaves to capture the tasty fats and seasonings, the same properties that also capture dirt and dust in the air. So I personally do not enjoy chewing on gritty sand or dirt. And also, God knows from whence that dust or dirt came, and it could come from neighboring fields that are not farmed in a sustainable organic fashion, and therefore might contain a number of chemicals that you really just don't want to eat. So even if your produce is organically farmed, I highly recommend giving it a wash anyway, always. But especially in the case of leafy vegetables, what I like to do is put it in a big bowl and give it a nice generous amount of water, like I'm basically creating a kale washing machine here. And I'm just sort of gently massaging and agitating. You don't want to do too vigorously, because then you'll bruise your leaves and they just won't have the stamina that you really want in a good kale chip. But of course, the agitation forces the water into all the little curls and crevices. And also, allowing it to float means that the silt and the dirt has somewhere to which to sink where there is not kale. Because what we want to do is separate the dirty, dusty matter from our food stuff. And so gravity will cause the heavy particles to sink to the bottom. And then, as a point of sustainability, another good reason to wash any of our veggies this way, actually, whether they're leafy or not, is that I can then take this water and dump it on my grass rather than just letting it run down the sink. And yes, you're going to say, but Contessa, do you really want potential chemicals that you're rinsing off of your things to go onto your grass? And I'm going to say, well, it's either going to end up in the sewer, in water treatment plants, or the water will go into my grass, and maybe my grass will be a little less organic than I might like it to be in terms of growing methods. But I don't eat my grass, and I think the waste of water is the bigger problem here. So I prefer, especially because I currently reside in a very dry place, and my grass really needs all the help it can get. And I can hear some of you judging me. Wait, you live in a desert and you have grass? Well, let me just say that I did not choose to live in this desert. I was forced to come here, and so by God, I will have my patch of green. But I do judge all those people who choose to live here voluntarily and wholeheartedly and decide to have grass. They have no right to grass. But I think those of us who didn't want to live here should absolutely be allowed our little tiny patches of green, our havens in an otherwise desolate, endless sea of prickly brown. Okay, so you can probably see that this water is now not very clear anymore, and that is in reflection of all of the particulate matter that has now come off of those leaves. So I'm going to actually manually transfer these to a sieve or a colander, strainer of some kind. Again, as you can see, I'm attempting to make sure that as much of the water ends up back in the bowl so that I can give my grass and or plants the maximum amount of water. And once I get as many of these bits as I can, I'm going to actually just give it another little rinse straight through into my bowl, again, so I can catch that water and feed it to my greenery. So the reason that I don't obviously just want to dump this water on top of the sieve to give it another rinse is that this water is dirty. And rinsing my greens in dirty water will definitely not achieve my goal. So, okay, I'm just going to set this off to the side for the moment. Let that keep draining. Unfortunately, I have no real way to suspend it above this bowl. I guess I could rig something very complicated up, but the little bit of water that's now going to drain out of my kale, I'm not as concerned about that. So, for those of you who really don't want to waste a single drop of water, my cameraman decided to prove that it's simple enough to create a drying, draining rack for one's draining kale by getting 2 metal tubes that probably support some kind of collapsible stand, and then just place them perpendicularly across your sink and then place your strainer over top of it. I'm really not certain that the effort was worth it. So, next step, we have to create our mixture, our oil mixture. So basically, the rough measurement for this is a tablespoon, 2 tablespoons of coconut oil per head of kale. I have 4 heads of kale. Now, tablespoon, yeah, I'm not going to take the time to measure this out carefully because this isn't a question of baking ratios, creating the perfect pastry or other baked good. So I'm just going to basically put in 8 spoonfuls of coconut oil into my pan. Now, coconut oil can come with some sustainability issues, so it is important, if you care about the planet and the future of ecosystems, our air, our water, that you try to identify the farming practices of your source of coconut oil. Because there are very sustainable, holistic ways of setting up coconut farms that replenish the land and don't destroy natural habitats. Okay. And there are ways to do it that just leave a swath of destruction and ruin ecosystems and even local economies. So, if you care, look into the source of your coconut oil and see what's what. There are actual certification programs and organizations that monitor such practices for you, so you don't really have to look that hard. Okay, as you'll notice, I'm now just going to rub the excess coconut oil into my hands. Coconut oil has a fatty acid profile that makes it highly absorbent in your skin, and so it's actually a really good moisturizer. So why wash your hands after using coconut oil when you can just rub it in, massage it into your cuticles, and you get a little bit of a mini spa treatment. So next ingredient is our sesame oil, or excuse me, our sesame paste, our tahini. And I don't want to contaminate this with coconut oil. It's not that anything bad per se would happen, but if you have an application for tahini which does not involve coconut oil, then you clearly don't want it to be contaminated. So usually it's about a teaspoon of tahini per kale head, and so that's like a tablespoon and a teaspoon. And again, you know, you could put 4 teaspoons, measure out 4 careful teaspoons of tahini if you really wanted to. I don't care that much about the perfect reproducibility from batch to batch. So just to recap, your ratios are per head of kale, 2 tablespoons of coconut oil and 1 teaspoon of tahini. And then I'm just going to melt this over low heat. It won't take much. Unrefined coconut oil liquefies at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 21 degrees centigrade. And the tahini doesn't really melt as such. It gets more liquidy because tahini is a paste actually. So there's quite a bit of solid matter in it. It is ground up sesame seeds. So it really won't take that long. Okay, so I like to keep it on heat until there are a few lumps left, and then I turn the heat off and let the residual heat finish the process. We don't want this oil to get too hot because first off, we're going to be rubbing it into the kale leaves with our fingers, and hot oil treatment is only good if it doesn't cause second-degree burns. Second off, we don't want it to actually cook the kale leaves. That's not how we make kale chips. So I just let the residual heat finish it off so it's all distributed. The tahini has sort of melted throughout. Okay, so we're just going to let that sit and cool down a bit. Again, like I said, I don't really feel like burning myself. So we're going to turn back to our kale and finish the drying process. So what I do after it's drained sort of passively, I press it and I tilt it just to get any extra water out. And then I'm going to dry it. Now, a lot of you may use paper towels. I think it's very wasteful. In reality, you don't need to use paper towels. For most things, you can just use a nice cloth towel. Nice plain linen or cotton. Not so much, I mean, you could use a terry cloth towel. I prefer tea towel style towels. So I'm going to just put this in here, and I'm just going to gently dry, pat the leaves dry. I don't want to compress too much. I don't want to mash the leaves because if you break them, then they break down. 5-second rule on the kale leaves. That horrible sound you are probably hearing is my cat. There he is.
Say hi to the camera.
Oh, he actually probably wants food. Well, he can wait. Apparently, he does not think that is true. Yeah, so actually, it will be easier to finish this process in your bowl. So I'm just going to take this water and feed it to my plants outside, my grass.
Mm-hmm.
My invisible doorman opens the door for me. Come on, more quickly, you're going to walk in front of me. Oh, yeah, actually, so if you come and look, you can actually see the really fine silt that is still in the bottom of this bowl, despite the fact that I just dumped it out. So yeah, you definitely don't really want to eat that. I mean, a little dirt's okay, but it probably won't feel good on your teeth if it's sort of larger. So I'm just going to give this a light rinse to make sure I get all the silt out. And then I'm going to take another towel, get any excess moisture. You don't need to get all the water off of your kale leaves. It's not necessary, but you certainly don't want water running down from your kale leaves. So I'm just going to empty that out. Okay, we're going to take a pause while I feed the orange bastard because otherwise he will not let us alone. So now that I have a little more room in which to operate, I'm just going to sort of lightly toss the leaves under the towel grasping lightly. Again, as I said, you don't want to crush it. You really don't want to break the structure of the kale leaves. We just want to eliminate the excess moisture. That's all. Okay, that's good enough. Then, since this is just water, I can just let this towel dry and then use it for towel flings. So, now we come to the distribution section. So what I like to do is actually do this in layers. Yeah. It makes it easier to mix, I find, if I put kale leaves in, add some of my oil mixture, mix, add more kale leaves, more oil, mix, right? Than just trying to get it all distributed from one big dump. So I'm going to take my oil, just give it a quick stir, and just use your spoon to dribble it around. All right. And then we're going to give our hands another spa day. So gently massage the oil into the leaves. Right. Okay, now because we're going to be doing this in multiple batches and we're going to ultimately have it all mixed together, there is not necessarily a need for you to make sure it's perfectly done at this point. So I'm going to add another bunch. And drizzle on some more of our oil mixture. Now the tahini adds flavor, but it also adds some really good healthy fatty acids and micronutrients that are found in tahini. Calcium, iron, sesame seeds are very nutritious, which doesn't mean you should eat a pound of them a day, but honestly there's probably no nut of which you should eat, nut or seed of which you should eat a pound a day. We aren't birds. Okay, next layer. I'm just going to warn you, dear viewer, that my feline companion is off in the distance howling piteously, and if he makes a reappearance of a more oral nature, I apologize. Ah, there he is. Yes.
Renaming your production studio to Bad Cat Filming.
Bad Cat Films. Bad Kitty. Why, Kitty, why? So my cat is a dry food junkie. And unfortunately, my husband gives into his addiction. Really, cats, most dry food is not good for kitties. We actually have dry food that is, but it is very calorically available, and my cat plumps out really quickly if he gets nothing but dry food. So we prefer to give him mostly wet food with a little bit of dry food. Well, when I'm not here to enforce that dietary regimen, someone in our household gives him lots of dry food and more dry food and more dry food, and he becomes even more addicted. And so even though he has fresh, super high quality wet food sitting in his bowl, he is completely dissatisfied with it because it does not have the flavor and crunch of his dry kibble. So we've started a policy of he doesn't get kibble until he has finished his wet food. And yes, he will cut off his nose to spite his face. He will ignore the food bowl for a whole day if it doesn't have what he wants in it. So now I'm just making sure to massage everything in. And now that we've got that first bit distributed, I'm going to actually start applying the rest. And you really do want, especially on these curly leaves, you really want to make sure you get into them, because there's nothing honestly less appealing than a kale chip that has dried with no fat on it. It's not good. It's sort of like straw-like and very papery, and not, the flavor just isn't the best when it's concentrated pure kale leaf with no fat or other tasty bits upon it. No. So dear viewer, this is the face with which I have to contend. Meow. Yeah. He and I meow at each other, each thinking we're speaking the other's language, where in reality, neither of us are speaking an actual language that anyone speaks. Yeah. Bit of trivia, apparently only house cats, or only cats that are tamed, actually meow. Feral cats do not. And it is basically their attempt to communicate with us, it seems. So they think they're speaking human language, and we think we're speaking kitty language, and never the twain shall meet. Now, it might seem really wet, and that's fine. It will dry out in the oven. And, we didn't get the leaves completely dry. If you have a salad spinner, you could probably use a salad spinner to get the kale much drier. I do not have a working salad spinner at the moment. Okay, no, bad kitty. Get down. Down. So one final massage to distribute all of that mixture, and then we're going to place this on our baking sheets. Now, there are different kinds of baking sheets, and I've experimented with several varieties, and I will tell you that flat open cookie sheets are the best, because if your cookie sheet has walls, then it actually retains the moisture, and it takes much, much, much longer for your kale to turn into chips than if you have flat open sheets. I shall demonstrate momentarily what I mean by flat open sheets. So, these are flat open sheets.
Oh, too close.
Right. Just a tiny little lip for grabbing out, but it's angled out, and plenty of open area for the moisture to evaporate. So now we're going to distribute our leaves onto this, and they can overlap somewhat, and that's fine. You really don't need to be too terribly careful about this. I like to minimize, you don't want empty space, because the chips will, or the kale will shrink as the moisture evaporates, sort of the opposite of what happens when you bake a cookie. And so space will be created as they dry. This allows you to get more kale onto each baking sheet. Okay, so now that we have our lettuce or kale arranged, I'm now going to put on the last two seasonings, and that's going to be our yeast flakes, followed by a light sprinkling of salt. And I do not do an amount on this, I just sprinkle, 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 sprinkle. And as I said earlier, this adds texture. It adds flavor. It actually adds umami, which is that flavor enhancing property. That fifth flavor, it's sometimes called. The third heat. It also adds nutritional value, protein and dietary fiber, and of course, because this has been enriched, although probably not with whole food vitamins, it adds some extra micronutrient value as well. And then from here, I'm going to just sprinkle on some of my, you want light. Let me tell you, I had my husband finish up a plate of these, or 2 pans of these, while I was on vacation, and they were so salty they hurt. So make sure you keep it light. You can always add more salt later, but unfortunately, once you bake the salt into the kale chips, there's no coming back. So, oh yeah, I've got some bolognese baking in there. I'll be making that into a lasagna. Stay tuned for that video. Just switch this side. So I like to bake these at 270 degrees. Honestly, you're just going to have to keep an eye on it. At least 40 minutes. It could take way longer though, because it will depend on your humidity and temperature and all of that. So yeah, I can't really tell you how long it will take. I can tell you what they'll look like when they're done, or I can show you eventually, probably at the end of this video, in fact. So we're just gonna go do our other sheet, and depending on your oven will really determine, and the size of your sheets will determine how many you can do at once. Honestly, I have no problem filling up the entire oven, all the rack, all the space with trays of kale chips and just letting it go. This is not a cake, it's not cookies, so there's no magic baking chemistry happening here that could be thrown off by overcrowding. Right? It's literally just a function of moisture evaporation and how long that takes. Because of my oven size and my sheet sizes, I really can only get 2 in at once. Okay, so now I'm just going to let that go until it's ready, and as I said, and now actually I've got salt on my hands, so now I'm giving my hands a salt scrub spa day. So once you've added the salt, so give it a good rub in, and then you can just rinse it and pat your hands dry, but don't use soap. Just use water to rinse off the excess and let your skin absorb the rest. So I guess we'll be rendezvousing back here in probably about an hour to look at our finished kale chips. Until then. So the timer just went off. Let's check our kale chips and see if they're actually where they need to be. So because the temperature in the oven is relatively low, 270 Fahrenheit, which is, like 110 degrees Celsius, you can just sort of touch and feel. And these, you can see they're very soft still, so definitely not. What's going to happen is this one, for example, is actually almost done. And that's pretty typical. The ones on the edge are going to dry more quickly than the ones in the center. But honestly, they reach at this temperature, they reach a point where they dry and they just stop. They're not really going to burn. So it's okay to just leave those ones there. And I'm just going to eat this one. Not bad. It's edible. Okay, so these aren't ready yet. But what you can do is if you see there's any that are maybe too layered, now that we've created some room along the edges, you can just sort of redistribute. Okay, so that layer's done. Let's see about the bottom layer. Nope, definitely still very soft. Again, the ones around the edges are pretty crispy. That's the chef spoils. Chef always gets chef spoils. But the ones in the center are still not even vaguely done. Okay, so back in the oven. Actually, now that I pull out the bolognese, I can go ahead and stagger that, which of course you always want to do if you can, to allow the air to move around more freely. timer back on so I don't forget about the kale chips. Not that I've ever done that. At this temperature, I feel like there's probably another 20 minutes on that. Okay, so we'll check back in 20 minutes. Okay, so timer's gone off again. These look good. These look promising. Yep. So I just do a light touch everywhere, and if they're all crunchy, we pull them out. And actually, this is kind of common. The ones on top toast more slowly than the ones on the bottom, so we still have some moisties here. So I'm just going to move this down to the bottom. And kind of feels like it's going to be another 10 minutes, but these are definitely done. These are perfect. And so I actually like to remove them from the sheet. I let them cool for a couple of minutes, but if you let them cool too long, then the fat resolidifies and it kind of glues them to the pan. So you actually do need to remove these from the pan when they're still warm. I store them in a nice ceramic container. Follow me and I'll show you my kale chip storage system. I like to store them in this container. And because I live in a desert, I don't have to worry about things getting moist and soggy. That is not a problem here. If you live, however, in a more normal place where humans should live that has moisture in the air, also known as relative humidity, then I would recommend an airtight container. But if your kale chips get a little stale, as in a little soggy, a little soft, it's no problem to just pop them on a baking sheet and pop them back in the oven for 5 or 10 minutes to crisp them back up again. In fact, that's a trick you can use on any kind of vegetable chip, potato, root, veggies of other kinds, to freshen them up. Tortilla chips as well. Just because they're soft and stale doesn't actually mean they're bad. Toast them up and it'll restore them to life. So this has been your Creative Contessa kale chips. If you have any questions, make sure to note in the comments. If you've enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you wish to support more such content and sort of facilitate my creativity and my sharing of various sorts of knowledge, then please subscribe to my Patreon page. Notes and details in the description. Well, happy cooking and happy kale chip eating.